Welcome to the Savannah Sideways podcast, the strange story of Savannah's ancient Roman statuary. I am your host, Jessica Leigh Lebos. Episode 6, Breaking Down the Myths. In the last episode, we heard a little bit from University of Georgia Antiquities professor Dr. Mark Abbe. Dr. Mark Abbe is a global expert on ancient art and has spent a good part of his career examining sculptural finds from archaeological sites in Italy, Greece, and all over the Mediterranean, which is considered the origin of what we call Western civilization. He also specializes in the science of restorations and surface analysis, which we'll get to later. In his undergraduate and graduate level classes, he presents these works in their historical, cultural, and even philosophical contexts. Lucky for me, I got a front row seat to Audit Ancient Art 101. We'd already talked about wealthy Americans taking the grand tour of Europe, and Dr. Abbe explained that there really wasn't an interest in bringing back antiquities from the Old World until after the Civil War and the rise of industry. That's when collecting art became sort of a sport amongst the elite. American industrialists started showing up in Paris and Rome and swooping up hundreds of artifacts and paintings at a time and shipping them back home. Some of them were never even unpacked. It was more about the acquisition, and it seemed to substantiate America's growing reputation for excess.
And there's this wonderful illustration, I don't know if you've seen it, but it's J.P. Morgan in Manhattan in like the New Yorker cartoon kind of way with a magnet. And across the Atlantic from Europe come statues of Aphrodite, all these antiquities, all works of art.
As with luxury yachts and coastal real estate, art collecting started trending among the barons and tycoons. The Carnegies amassed over 100,000 objects of art, and coal mogul Henry Frick's New York mansion had works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, and El Greco on the walls. But the accumulating wasn't limited to the Northerners.
Then, in the early 20th century, there is this development in the Gilded Age of these large collections formed by wealthy people. The Biltmore estate, when that opens up, that sort of you have a lot of peer competition, right? And that sort of just like moves what was once a New York and Manhattan and Boston phenomenon out across the country. You start getting in the southeast, you get the Biltmore, then you get Greenwich, and somewhat later you get Vizcaya, which is something that I've been working on, which is in Miami, but it has a collection of antiquities that's similar.
Villa Vizcaya, now the Vizcaya Museum and Gardens on Biscayne Bay, once belonged to businessman John Deering, who began building his palatial 34-room Tuscan-style winter residence in 1916. Deering also acquired a significant amount of ancient Roman statuary, including an effigy of Julius Caesar that he placed at the front entrance. Caesar was Rome's first emperor, and by the way, he didn't make that top 5 list. Dr. Abbe says that other than Deering, Spencer Schotter's collection of ancient Roman statues is unique to the southern United States.
So all the other ones that I'm aware of, except for Vizcaya,
Abbe.
really don't have any.
It's more.
There's not antiquities. They're really not art galleries. And
Okay.
even the Biltmore.
He explained that building these massive estates and gardens to deliberately fill them with marble sculptures and paintings by the masters wasn't just an ostentatious display of wealth. It was about defining America as a civilized place where people appreciated the high bar of culture set by the Renaissance and the Roman ancestors. Collecting art showed that even if American industrialists were nouveau riche, they could still level up to the sophistication of European aristocracy.
A key thing in looking at the sculpture here is, and thinking about the estate and everything, is like, okay, it's one thing, just like today, it's one thing to have a lot of money and to come through it through industry, and it's another thing to display that you know how to use that money and how you can display culture through it.
So these wealthy art collectors were reflecting this new era of American prosperity and serving as aspirational icons. Basically, they were the influencers of the day. The most influential of all, the one who the rest of them were trying to emulate, was Isabella Stewart Gardner, a Manhattan-born socialite who entertained newspaper muckrakers with her eccentric clothing and unconventional behavior. Maybe today she would have garnered millions of views with her makeup tutorials or launched her own shapewear line. But she lived in the late 1880s, and her covetable claim was that she was one of the first Americans to build a formidable art storehouse and share it with the general public. After the death of their only child, Isabella and her Boston society husband traveled through Asia and Europe, spending a lot of time in Rome and Venice. In 1891, she began focusing on buying art, and with her $1.7 million inheritance, she and Harvard-trained advisor Bernard Berenson put together one of the world's most comprehensive and important art collections, adding Roman antiquities and major Renaissance paintings to Chinese pottery and a Stradivarius violin. Gardner built a sumptuous 3-story building with a glass-enclosed courtyard to house it all. And in 1903, 20 years after Merry Telfair, by the way, opened a public museum in the Fenway area of Boston. This kicked off an era of philanthropy characterized by introducing the public, the people, to levels of art and culture they would never have had the opportunity to be exposed to before. These benefactors of the Gilded Age not only felt they were the guardians of Western civilization, but civilizers themselves.
Really, it's about prestige, but it's also, they really think that these things are civilizing. These are the people that are building our national museums and think that the way to curb the excesses of American culture and society, is through these kinds of institutions.
So there was an element of magnanimity to the millionaire class. It wasn't simply about setting up foundations and funneling funds for a tax break. There was a noblesse oblige amongst these wealthy industrialists to fulfill an obligation to create meaningful, lasting contributions for those less privileged and to establish paths for others to succeed. Dr. Abbe cites J.P. Morgan as a prime example. Morgan parlayed his railroad fortune into steel mergers and utility conglomerates, and he is vilified as one of the greediest and most ruthless of the Gilded Age robber barons. Remember the giant magnet? But Morgan was also the major force behind the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, and was also a trustee of the American Museum of Natural History, still both venerated institutions of American life. In fact, when he died at 75 of heart failure, his personal fortune was far less than anyone expected because he'd given the majority of it away to charity. Then there's Andrew Carnegie, who with his riches turned himself into the patron saint of public libraries, funding over 2,500 libraries worldwide between 1883 and 1929. Born into poverty and the very definition of a self-made man, Carnegie required communities to follow a certain formula in order to receive funding for a library. That included providing the building site and proving a financial commitment to its upkeep and staffing. He did this to prevent libraries from being usurped by the ruling class, which he had seen with attempts to ameliorate social ills with endowments that didn't really seem to make a difference in people's lives. Carnegie also knew that in order for citizens to use and care about their libraries, they had to have a stake in it. Committees spent years raising money and planning before submitting an application, and there was no guarantee the funding would be granted. Savannah has 2 Carnegie libraries. The most visible is the Bull Street Library, a grand 2-story white neoclassical structure in the center of the Thomas Square neighborhood. The Savannah Public Library Committee received a Carnegie grant for $75,000 and hired Hyman Wallace Whitcover, the same architect who designed City Hall, to build it. It opened in 1916 for use by the city's white residents. But that wasn't Savannah's first public library. Another Carnegie library had opened the year before in 1915, its funding applied for and construction organized by the city's African American community. Originally dedicated as the Colored Library of Savannah, what is now simply called the Carnegie is nestled between 2 houses on East Henry Street, not far from downtown. It served as a vital nexus of education and refuge during and after segregation for generations of citizens, including Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who grew up in the nearby enclave of Pinpoint. Designed by local architect Julian de Bruin Copps, it is the city's only example of the Prairie School style developed by Frank Lloyd Wright, and it's included on the Georgia Public Library Service's list of the state's 10 most beautiful public libraries. While smaller and more modest than the Bull Street Library, the Carnegie is far more interesting in my opinion. It has striking details with a red and black brick pattern and tapered pillars topped with cement orbs leading up to the entrance. The glass transom above the door is expertly etched with the likenesses of 7 Black business leaders instrumental in its establishment. Unfortunately, the Carnegie has been closed for renovations since 2024 due to flood damage and will hopefully reopen in early 2026 for all to enjoy. But anyway, as tempting as it is to revile the industrialists of the 20th century for their excess and exploitation, and even indulge in a little schadenfreude at their downfalls, at least some of them tried to direct their wealth into uplifting the lives of the masses. Even as proponents of the progressive era took up the mantle of libraries and public education as well as national parks and other civic projects, classical art appreciation wasn't a priority. It's really the Gilded Age millionaires we have to thank for their legacy of bringing art to the people.
I think it's so easy to poke fun at and be a little bit cynical and see the flip side of the coin. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that is one of the great phenomenons of American culture, is this idea that, that's the only way that a place like the Met or the National Gallery, that's the only reason they exist, because we as a culture don't have any notion of the federal government, of even our state governments, supporting the arts and culture, right? So this is like how, it's kind of the Faustian bargain, yeah.
Right.
But this is how it happens.
Of course, this brings us back to the Greenwich statues. If Spencer Schotter hadn't lost his fortune and had the opportunity to make benevolent contributions to society, might he have eventually offered his incredible art collection to the public? If he were alive today, would he use his wealth to build rocket ships to space or open a museum for the enrichment of all? And is it too far-fetched to think he'd much rather keep his collection together in Savannah instead of pieced out on the auction block? I don't know. Neither does Dr. Abbe. But he does know a few more interesting things about the statues. We'll talk about that after the break. The Savannah Sideways podcast is brought to you by... Is it time for your annual eye exam? Dr. Erika Morrow and the staff at ForSight Unique Eyewear and Eye Care in historic downtown Savannah provide a high-level professional experience that is clearly above the rest. Dr. Morrow provides eye care personalized to your needs. Plus, you'll find the coolest, highest quality selection of frames in town. It's all about the optics. Schedule your appointment today at forsighteye.net. When people ask me about the best seafood in Savannah, there's no hesitation. I send them to Bubba Gumbo's on Tybee Island. This is a family-run, water-to-table situation where you can be sure that whatever you're served, perfectly grilled, blackened, or fried, was swimming in the sea this morning, and the guy who reeled it in is probably sitting at the bar. If you'd rather cook at home, BG Seafood Co-op next door can hook you up with the same fresh fruits de mer that they're preparing in the kitchen, and they'll even fillet it all for you and pack it on ice. And should you need a safe harbor to keep your boat, the Tybee Marina, where it all goes down, is happy to oblige you with a slip. Remember, my good people, friends don't let friends eat imported shrimp. Next time you're hankering for local seafood, head to Bubba Gumbo's and BG Seafood at the Tybee Marina on Lazaretto Creek. Around here, we already know that truth is stranger than fiction, and a lot more interesting, too. If you love cemeteries and you want to delve deep into Savannah's most famous one, you need to meet Don Touton, better known as Bonaventure Don. He offers true stories galore as you stroll through the gravestones. No ghosts, no nonsense, but you might see a wild fox. Whether you're a local or just making a pilgrimage to Savannah's iconic hallowed grounds, Bonaventure Don will give you an experience to last a lifetime, and perhaps beyond. Book a tour now at bonaventuredon.com. When it comes to determining the value of the Greenwich statues, it's important to remember that they've never undergone any kind of authentication process. A newspaper article from the 1950s references them as coming out of the ruins of Pompeii, something that's been repeated but not confirmed. Yes, there are records of their purchasing in Rome and their arrival to Savannah, and they've been displayed at the Telfair Museum for over 60 years. The 2012 appraisal goes pretty deep into the provenance of each piece. But nobody has ever actually studied the statues from a scientific perspective. I asked Dr. Abbe about the difference between appraisal and authentication.
It's an appraisal of the goods value of the marketplace, right? And so, in general, you get people that are appraising things that they don't necessarily have specialists. That's the nature of the game. And, you know, it's a financial enterprise. Whereas authentication, in the strict sense, is dealing with the actual historical authenticity at the material level of an object.
He's quick to note that he isn't in the business of authenticating things for the market, and that his interest in the statues is purely academic. The appraisal is also similarly unbiased, conducted for insurance replacement values rather than sale, using a methodology that compares the sales of similar items. While ultimately that does come down to finances, the appraiser Deborah Freer did a whole lot of dirty work tracking down the origin story of many of the pieces. Some of the documentation includes affidavits from the U.S. Deputy Consul in Rome that list the exact places Spencer Schotter shopped, including the renowned Galleria San Giorgi on the Palazzo Borghese where he bought the double-headed Hermes. The head of Caracalla and the rest of the marble bust came from the workshop of Curzio Carpenetti and were brokered by Alessio Borghi, a well-known art dealer and archaeologist who sold works to museums and private collections all over the world. Around the time Schotter was acquiring his statues on his grand tour, there was a pair of English speakers in Rome working to help their fellow countrymen fill their collections. John Marshall was born in Liverpool, England, and met Massachusetts-born Edward Perry Warren at Oxford in the mid-1880s. This openly gay couple became sought-after experts in the antiquities trade. They traveled in the same social circles as satirist Oscar Wilde and French painter Henri Matisse, as well as wealthy collectors like Isabella Stewart Gardner and J.P. Morgan. There's a common photo that features them in the matching hats holding their little dogs. It's adorable. These men built their own spectacular collection of Greco-Roman artifacts, including the famous Warren Cup, a silver chalice from the 1st century depicting men engaging in sexual congress, now displayed at the British Museum. Between Warren's impeccable taste and Marshall's historical expertise, the pair gained a reputation for finding the choicest pieces for American collectors, at a 20% markup, of course. By the turn of the century, they basically had total control over the market. 90% of the works at the Museum of Fine Art in Boston were bought by Marshall and Warren. Though there isn't specific mention of them in relation to Spencer Schotter's collection, thousands of pieces they brokered remain in the possession of prominent museums and private collectors. But Dr. Abbe says that many of these works might not be ancient at all, or at least parts of them. Apparently, it was common practice, and not a secret one, to offer reproductions of Roman sculptures or amalgamations composed of materials from different periods to keep up with demand. In fact, piecing together new and old fragments like a jigsaw puzzle was a thriving and perfectly respectable cottage industry.
So everyone from Michelangelo down is, on the one hand, advocating for their new creations, but also working on the side, as on like the gig economy, of producing, classicizing bits of ancient pieces, reincorporated into new works for the grand tour trade. I mean, people want these marble sculptures. In the 18th century, they don't even really care how much of them are ancient or not.
So authenticity wasn't necessarily an important aspect for Gilded Age antiquities collectors. But that's not even the most shocking thing about some of these ancient Roman statues. What if the whole notion about white marble sculpture representing the aesthetic ideal of Western art and civilization is completely false? Back at the turn of this century, when Dr. Abbe was still a graduate student, he was working on an archaeological dig in the ancient Greek city of Aphrodisias, which was once a bastion of artistic production until it was destroyed by an earthquake in the 7th century. As he was examining marble statues recovered from the site, he noticed there were bits of color on many of them. Red and pink on the lips, gold and black in the hair. peach and beige and tan and brown on the arms, chests, and legs. That's when he realized that when these sculptures were originally on display in ancient times, they were never actually white at all. On the contrary, the human figures of antiquity had once been painted in vibrant hues and in a variety of skin tones from pale to olive to ebony. For hundreds of years, those excavating and curating these pieces had scrubbed them until they gleamed, perhaps first out of a misguided urge to clean them up as they were rediscovered and elevated during the Renaissance. But the idea that the statues were originally in their alabaster state took hold, and from there, the concept that white sculpture represented the pinnacle of beauty was perpetuated until the lie became accepted as truth. It's the reason that sculptures created at the height of the Renaissance meant to exalt the perfect human form, like Michelangelo's colossal statue of David, were left unpainted. As the centuries went on, museums and art dealers diligently stripped traces of paint from statues of antiquity to make them seem more authentic and more collectible. Dr. Abbe is now one of the world's most foremost experts in the polychromy of ancient art. He uses powerful microscopes and X-ray fluorescence analysis to discover and recreate the original colors and has helped others present them as the artists intended. There have been exhibitions at the Met and the De Young Museum in San Francisco. The exact full-scale replica of the Parthenon in Nashville, Tennessee, contains a 42-foot-tall marble statue of the goddess Athena in all of her red-lipped golden glory. Yet most people are still shocked when they hear that what we've been taught about ancient art is completely wrong. I know I was. It's not like people aren't talking about this. Dr. Abbe and other researchers were featured in a 2018 New Yorker article by journalist Margaret Talbot called The Myth of Whiteness in Classical Sculpture. In it, Talbot calls the idealization of white marble an aesthetic born of a mistake. She also explores the obvious cultural implications. There has always been a through line between classical studies and white supremacy, fueled by the certitude that white Western culture goes all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome. White marble statuary has played a huge part in this perception. But the reality is, in that part of the world at that time, people came from all sorts of backgrounds. The Roman Empire stretched from what's now North Africa all the way up to Great Britain. Skin color wasn't a bias or a signifier in the way that we think about it now in modern times. For sure, the Romans had their castes and classes, and they definitely engaged in human slavery. But it wasn't based on race. They enslaved everybody. It wasn't until Europe emerged from the Dark Ages that the emphasis on white skin became a collective identity for certain cultures, evolving with colonization and the enslavement of Black Africans. So that means the idealization of white marble isn't just a mistake of aesthetics and archaeology. It's a gross error of human history that many of us accept as truth. Even with the evidence that Roman statues were created in a full spectrum of color, there's still so much in our own culture memorialized in white. The Lincoln Memorial, the headstones in almost every cemetery, and all of those white plaster casts used to teach generations of artists about the ideal of the human form. But now we know otherwise. Spread the word. Dr. Abbe hasn't had the opportunity to examine the Greenwich statues with his microscopes and spectrometers yet. But he says there probably isn't much to find anyway, since they were likely scoured before coming up for sale in the 19th century and then baked out in the sun for so long. The river gods and the Corinthian column tops from the 17th century were probably always white, but there's a good chance that the double-headed Janus Herms and the busts from the 3rd century, or at least parts of them, originally had painted clothing, hair, and skin.
Our assumption should be that that essentially everything was polychrome in antiquity. There's a whole variety of color languages. It's not a yes or no, but the reality is a whole spectrum. And so no doubt that a number of these ancient pieces were polychromed in antiquity.
I'm trying to imagine that as I squint over the appraisal photos of the statues still in storage. You're probably wondering, do we ever get to see the rest of these statues? We do, but I have a couple more rabbit holes to take you down. Listen, we spent a lot of time setting this table. We might as well savor the meal. See you in episode 7 of The Strange Story of Savannah's Ancient Roman Statuary. The Savannah Sideways podcast is brought to you by The 5 Spot. Ancient artifacts may be fragile, but the 5 Spot's new menu is rock solid. Classics like the signature meatloaf and chicken fried chicken are still part of the permanent collection, while new masterpieces like Todd's famous chili and loaded mac and cheese with Mojo pulled pork and collard greens have joined the rotating exhibit. These curators of comfort food present a lineup of juicy burgers and giant salads for lunch and dinner 7 days a week, plus their famous brunch every Saturday and Sunday that's overflowing with bloodies and mimosas. With locations in Sandfly, Habersham Village, and Richmond Hill, the 5 Spot has something delicious for everyone at your table. And by Ships of the Sea Maritime Museum. Housed in the historic Scarborough House, the Ships of the Sea Maritime Museum pays homage to America's great maritime past while expanding its lens towards some of the city's most exciting artistic voices. Wander through luxurious galleries of ship models and modern installations, amble amongst exquisite gardens, or attend, or host, an event at the finest open-air venue in town. Book it all at shipsofthesea.org. Special thanks to our friends under the Lincoln Oaks. If you're too dumb for Starland and too ugly for downtown, there is a seat at the table and a spot at the bar for you at SIXBY, Lone Wolf Lounge, Over Yonder, and Mood Rights. This little slice of shade in Midtown is where the most fun goes down. And by Shot by Somi, award-winning portrait and brand photography for every occasion. A photo isn't just an image, it's a story whispered through light and time. Book your session at shotbysomi.com. The Savannah Sideways podcast is produced by D. Daniels Media, female-owned full podcast production services for businesses, nonprofits, and special projects. Storytelling with a purpose. Go to ddanielsmedia.com.